It's a real pleasure for me to introduce one of my heroes, Ralph Metzner. Ralph was one of the original 3 researchers in the Harvard program with Tim Leary. Contributed in a very profound way to that organization through his focus on methodology. Horizons is not really about the 60s. It's about contemporary research. And Ralph has maintained his career and his focus at the leading edge and has demonstrated sort of the heart and the soul and the spirituality in a way that comes from mature psychedelics use.
Thanks.
Thank you.
All right. Okay. Thank you very much. I'd like to focus my remarks on 3 substances, all 3 of which have a use in healing in shamanic societies and have also found an application in contemporary psychotherapy. In some ways, you could say psychotherapists are the inheritors of the shamanic traditions, but actually shamanism is broader than that because it includes all forms of healing. So it would include, they don't make a separation between physical medicine and psychological medicine and spiritual practice. It's all one thing. It's not religion and psychology and medicine. This is sort of my equivalent of E equals MC squared. This is the formula that helps you to understand every experience that you have, including this experience that we're having right now. There is an intention. You had an intention in coming here to hear the various speakers, and I have an intention in coming here to speak and also to listen and interact with you. And it can also be thought of as an intention or as a question. And that set is another word for intention, determines what we're going to pay attention to. In German, you say, you give the gift of attention. And you're giving me a gift by receiving what I'm saying. And I appreciate that. So now, our attention could, on the other hand, be captured by something else. It could, for example, if a naked woman walked into the room, then our attention would be focused on that, and you'd stop listening to me. But given everything else, under normal circumstances, the intention or question you have in your mind determines what you're going to attend to and what is going to go more into the market. And that then determines what you're going to become aware of. So that's the basic formula for all experience, whether it's an altered drug state or ordinary state, this experience that we're having right now. This is what I call a general heuristic model for states of consciousness. And here we talked about sentencing, and my old colleague and mentor, Timothy Leary, was responsible for this formulation of set and setting, which has become widely understood in the field. To account for any kind of mind-altering drug experiences, you have to include the set and the setting. And I would say, actually, the set being the intention is actually the primary, because the set determines what kind of setting you're going to choose. So the people who are doing studies on end-of-life anxiety or with cancer patients, or they're choosing, or with PTSD, they're choosing a medical setting. And people that want to drop ecstasy and go to a rave dance, they're choosing a completely different setting according to their intention. So of the two, they're both equally affect the experience, but the set and the intention is actually primary because that determines the setting that you choose. Unless you don't pay attention to that, in the 60s, people didn't pay attention to that. They just said, let's go down to Haight Street and drop acid. So that was the setting. They didn't consider the fact, that there's a lot of preparation involved. So the set includes the intention, the questions, if you're working on healing, what is it you're trying to heal, and the preparation. And then there's the experience. Different changes take place in thinking, feeling, perception. And then there's the phase of integration where you try to talk about and integrate and how to apply that. And I would actually say, as a general rule of thumb now, for the use of these powerful mind-altering substances would be to spend an equal amount of time on those 3 parts of the experience. Spend several hours preparing for a psychedelic experience that may last several hours. It would be worth it, and the experience would be that much deeper and more profound. and spend several hours integrating it afterwards. And of course, the people who are doing the psychotherapy research are doing that anyway, because the experience is integrated into an ongoing psychotherapy process. The only exception to that would be a very short-acting drug like DMT, which may only last like half an hour or less even, where if to get the most out of it, you want to spend a lot of time preparing. I mean, not only the physical preparation of the setting, but the mental preparation, which would be a meditative set. People that have done Buddhist or any kind of meditation, mindfulness meditation, the more they learn to concentrate, the more they would get out of altered states kinds of experiences with these very powerful substances that can enhance consciousness. Okay, I'm going to go on to the Janus model of divination and integration. Janus is the Roman deity that has two faces facing in opposite directions. I interpret that as a symbol for looking into the past and the future. And I say we have the equal ability to look into the past and the future. And except in our worldview, we don't think we do. We think we can remember the past, but we can't predict the future because the future hasn't happened. Traditional societies don't believe that. And it's interesting that in some formulations of modern quantum physics, that's no longer true. The time doesn't have a directional arrow that the future is equally accessible to as the past. In traditional cultures, people use the substances like the mushrooms or ayahuasca for healing, which relates always to the past. When you're healing something in general, it's always related to the past, isn't it? If you go to a doctor and you have an infection or a bite or a psychologist or psychotherapist and you're dealing with a trauma, the starting question is always, well, how did this start? When did it start? What happened? When did you get bitten? When did you get hit? When did you do like that? And then you want to integrate it. So there's a double movement, what I call a double movement of going into the past, looking at a past event, and then integrating that past event. It's not just going into the past. That's not enough. Because then you can just spend all your time diddling around in the past without making any changes, you see. You want to integrate what you find, like take a person who's dealing with a trauma where there's been an experience that's been painful and that's kind of frozen, surrounded by fear. So they go into the past, you relive the trauma in a protected space with protective support from other people, which you didn't have at the time of the trauma, and then you integrate that memory so that you can then have the memory. But you don't have the charge around it anymore. So it's not like you're driving along looking into the rearview mirror. You haven't wiped out the memory, but the memory doesn't have the charge. It's going to trap you and fix you into a sudden dissociative state. I like the word remembering. It's a very interesting word because it means literally remembering means the opposite of dismembering. It's reconnecting with something from which you've been disconnected. See, the person who's had a traumatic experience has gotten disconnected. He can't remember. He can't think of the experience without freaking out and without being back into that terror state. And so healing would be that he'd remember it, but it's okay. And he's integrated it. And that means that then your present sense of identity would be expanded. You would be a trauma survivor rather than a traumatized person. A similar double movement occurs in visioning. So the other main purpose for which traditional people use these psychoactive substances for visioning, getting a preview of the future. And a vision is not a prediction. It's very important to understand the difference. People often say, well, you can't predict the future, so why work with the future? But actually, we have visions all the time. We have visions, we make intentions. You have a vision when you get up in the morning and you go to work because you anticipate that your work is going to be there and you're going to have the job and you have a pretty good sense of what you're going to be working on. You're not predicting. Of course, other things can happen. So there is a difference between the future and the past, but the similarity is there's a double movement. If you're doing healing, you have a vision of the healing state that you want to accomplish. You want to feel less anxious about that state. Or you might, if you're a creative person, you might have a vision of, well, I want to create something. I want to write a book. I want to do a painting, a piece of music that has these characteristics, that inspires this, expresses this idea that I had. And in traditional cultures, this was widely accepted. For example, you read interviews with Maria Sabina, the famous Mexican Mazatec, Mexican mushroom shamanist. She would often be asked by the people in her village, to take the mushrooms and to see, well, the son of the family maybe has gone to the United States and they haven't heard from him in 2 years and they don't know if he's safe and if he's going to come back or anything. And then she might go and talk to the mushroom spirits, and she might be able to say, yes, he's coming back and he's okay, and like that. So going into the past in order to integrate past painful experiences into the present, and then going into the visioning means going into the future in order to realize, to perceive a goal, a purpose, and then to realize it. That's the equivalent of remembering, is to realize it. Because it's not enough just to have a vision, you have to integrate the vision, right? If you just have a vision and you don't do anything about it, what is that? It's a fantasy. It's kind of pointless. You may not be able to integrate it. It's a chancy thing, but at least you have to start. And when some traditional cultures would go on a vision quest, that meant they went on a quest to see, maybe involving fasting, maybe involving alone time in the wilderness, in order to get a vision for their life. And of course, that's an aspect of healing. When you're healing, you're envisioning what kind of life am I going to have when I'm healed? Psychotherapy, which is my profession that I was trained in, tends to focus on the past. But it's interesting that now the field is changing a little bit, and more and more psychotherapists are also doing what's called coaching, which comes out of the business world, because in the business world, people are relatively much more interested in the future than in the past. That makes sense in a way, because they want to know where sales are going to go. And I asked a couple of businessmen who were in my group, what percentage of the time there in their professional life they spend thinking about the past versus the future? And they said, we would say 95% of the time, the future. The past only, and those exceptional circumstances where we did something, we had a plan or a project, or an object that we wanted to sell and it didn't quite work out, and we made a mistake and we want to figure out what we did wrong. The other application where the visioning, the future visioning of possibilities and potentials comes in creativity studies. For example, creativity studies were done in California in the 60s, late 60s, at Stanford Research Institute with creative artists, getting them to envision say architectural designs or designs of inventions, and then that they were working on, and then they would sketch, they would take with a low dose of LSD, they'd get an idea, they would kind of sketch it, and then of course there's the process of integration. So it's not enough to have the vision, you also have to integrate it, and that's called realization, making it real. The central field is what I call the self-system. And I take here from the systems theories that reality is basically constituted of relations rather than things and objects and individuals. Maybe you think this is like a subtle conceptual change, but it has profound implications about the subject-object distinctions. Everything that we are actually relations. You can't say anything about yourself unless it's relational. The feminist philosophers have actually formulated, they say it this way, relations are essentially constitutive. They're not an add-on. It's not like, well, I'm a man and I have relations. That's not the way it is. You can't define who you are except by your relations. I'll prove that to you. Every one of us is the son or daughter of a man and a woman we call mother and father. That's pretty central to who you are. You couldn't be anybody unless you were the son or daughter of a man and a woman. That's a relation. You may also have brothers and sisters. That's a relation. You may have children yourself. That's a relation. You have lots of relations with other individual human beings. You may also have a relation with an animal, like a pet or other animals in your professional life. You may also have relations with plants, especially if you're a gardener and you have a gardener. You could have relations with environments, with places. You have a relation with places. For example, think of the relationship to the place you call home. It's a very different relationship than you have maybe to the place you live or the place you visit sometimes. Or perhaps you go sometimes to a place you seek a vision, or you go for a retreat, that's another place. Or you go to a church to pray and to have a religious experience. You may also have relations with beings that are no longer alive. If you have a relative that has already died, like a mother or father or grandfather or grandfather, you still have that relation. So you have a relation with the spirit of somebody who is no longer alive. And in many traditional cultures, that relationship is actually considered an equally important relationship, and I would agree with that. It's equally important. It's the same relationship. Your father is still your father even if he's dead. This is very important for some people all of us really, to realize, especially if we've lost a family member. We use that expression, we lost a family member. Actually, you haven't lost a family member. It's just they're still your family member, except they now exist in the spirit world and not in this world. And once you allow that thought, that conception of reality, it's a different worldview, then you are open to having a relationship with the people that are in the spirit world. And of course it's different than when they're still in this world as well. Because we also exist in the spirit world while we're alive. Here's a picture of somebody you probably all recognize, Terence McKenna. Yes. A pioneer for sure. And with his hands standing next to a Banisteriopsis vine, which is one of the two key ingredients in the ayahuasca brew. And there's a preparation process. The ayahuasca brew is actually a combination of at least two plants, the plant that has the MAO inhibitor and the plant that has the DMT analog, which gives the vision, but the MAO inhibitor, which prevents that chemical from being broken down in the stomach. So you need the two. The leaves provides the DMT analog, and the bark provides the MAO inhibitor. Here's a painting of an ayahuasca vision by Pablo Amaringo, who's a traditional South American shamanism from Peru, who worked with ayahuasca and then became a painter. And this looks like a picture of an intestinal tract. You see, that's one of the characteristics of ayahuasca in comparison to all the other hallucinogens. It has this very powerful purging action. I've come to think that purging action is the key to its popularity. I've edited 2 books of collections of experiences, one on ayahuasca experience and one on mushroom experiences. One on ayahuasca experiences sells twice as many copies. And I'm trying to figure out, why is that? They're not actually intrinsically more interesting, but I think the difference is in the purgation, which in itself is kind of peculiar when you think of it. People take this substance and it makes them throw up. And they say, when can I take it again? This was a profoundly healing experience. That's why the ayahuasca will never be a street drug, because people don't want to go, around puking in the street. And it's not like they want to puke, but they feel after they've puked, they feel fantastic. They feel cleaned out, and visibly cleaned out. They can see it. In our society, we're overloaded with so much stimulation and so much pollution, and we don't have very good ways of purging that pollution out of our system. The purging in ayahuasca, it's not a symptom that you're getting sick. It's a symptom you're letting something go, and then afterwards you feel fantastic. And that's why they call the traditional shamans, they call it la purga, purging. Purge the toxicity of contemporary life. And this is another one by Pablo Amaringo, where also you can see the snake. There's often snake imagery. So imagery of a giant serpent, very common in ayahuasca. And oftentimes people might see the geometric patterns on the body of the snake. And they actually sometimes distinguish 3 kinds of snakes: the snake that crawls through the forest floor, and the snake that goes through the river, and then the snake that goes through flies through the air, and the kind of spirits riding on it. And this is what you can see here. You can see there's a snake, and there's these little sort of dancing figures. The dresses are kind of spinning around, kind of a rotary action going through the intestinal tract, cleaning out the inside. While the shaman, who's singing the songs, that accompany the dances of these little spirits. One ayahuasca vision I once had is like the little dwarf spirits were like, I'm going through my system, cleaning it out. And as they were cleaning it out, they're not just cleaning out toxins, they're dismantling your psychic structure. I remember thinking, wait a minute, you can't take that away. That's a piece of me that you're carting away there. what are you doing? And they said, and they kind of sang, they didn't miss a beat. They said, don't worry, we'll bring it back. You'll be fine. You'll be put back together again. Singing as they go, as they were dismantling my ego structures. The biggest application of ayahuasca is in this kind of generic, deep intestinal, but not just intestinal, physical, but the intestinal as a kind of a symbolic expression of mental, emotional, and spiritual detoxification and renewal in that sense. Oh, I want to say something about iboga. I don't have any pictures of that. So iboga is a root extract from an African root plant used in Gabon and other cultures as part of a cultural thing. And it's found a major application in this country in the treatment of addiction, because it seems to have the property of actually shutting off the craving for a considerable length of time at a high dose. But I do want to point out that the use of ibogaine in addiction treatment, which is relatively legal, it's not legal in the United States, but there are some other countries like Holland, and then there are some clinics in Mexico where addicts can go and have that treatment. It's a very intensive treatment, involves 3 days. The amounts of ibogaine that they give are quite large. But ibogaine was available and was used in the 60s and even earlier. It was first Claudio Naranjo, a Chilean psychiatrist, published a book on visionary substances, including ibogaine, and in psychotherapy, as an extension of psychotherapy, you're not using that large doses anymore. I would say phenomenologically, the principal difference from other substances like ayahuasca or mushrooms is that it's a very strong sense of kind of mental objectivity. And you can see where, in the African Iboga cult, they talk about Mr. Iboga who comes to you as a male form, rather than the mushroom spirits are thought of as little children, you see. The Mazatec Indians think the mushroom spirits are little children, los niños. So Mr. Iboga is a kind of a very, and has that quality of very objectively. It's not cold emotionally, but it's more detached. It has a way of showing you the strengths and weaknesses of your life without judging you about it. In our studies at Harvard, we started off using psilocybin, not the mushroom, but the chemical. Psilocybin is to this day not really a street drug. Mushrooms, of course, are available in the street, but the traditional way of using the mushroom, like with the Mazatec Indians, is for healing and for visioning. Just like ayahuasca, people have figured out how to grow their own mushrooms, basically. And so rather than, you don't have to go to Mexico to work with a shaman, you can have homegrown mushrooms. And so then this is the most accessible substance for people who use it in the underground. They're widely available at rave events and all of that. Of course, they're totally illegal, and you can go to jail for having them or much less selling them. But nevertheless, that's part of the paradox of our situation, you see. These mind-expanding healing drugs and substances are totally illegal. You can't actually get them. And even if you participate in a controlled research study, that's valuable and useful, but how many people can that address? You know, how many people can that have access to that? Not very many compared to the need. A couple of things that impressed me from the talks yesterday, the statement and the conclusion of the subject. All subjects in the study requested further doses, and none of them could get it, right from the get-go. They knew that, the researchers knew that. The healer has discovered a substance that is healing, and he can't give it to the patients that want it and need it. Not because it's dangerous, because legal and political limitations make it inaccessible. An ethical quandary produced by a social political context, which I think is important for us to recognize and to think about what it means. What kind of a society do we live in that healing medicines with demonstrated usefulness in alleviating suffering can't be used, except in very, very narrow contexts? That's not true of any other kind of medicine. I was very impressed from the New York study, for the woman who said how she could be loving with the psilocybin to everyone, and then she finally hit upon the fact she could be loving and have love to herself, and that was the last person she thought of. The last person she thought of feeling loving towards is herself. That's a very significant thing, and it's very common for people to say that, because most of the people that we know are people-oriented. We want to help others. We even may have an idea it's better to love another than yourself. But it's actually not true. And I would remind you of the teachings of Jesus Christ actually say, love thy neighbor as thyself. That's what it says. Love thy neighbor as thyself. Not more than thyself, and not less than thyself, but as thyself. That's the core teaching of Christianity.
What is your favorite psychedelic compound and why?
I'm a researcher, and I'm reporting on the experiences and the applications of these different substances. My personal experience is really my private matter, like my sex life. It's, technically speaking, none of your business. And that's okay, you know, that's okay. I don't mind the question.
I was intrigued by your description of Iboga as having this personality. Mr. Iboga, you had any other comments about different personalities that you think other substances have?
Maria Sabina referred to the mushrooms as los niños, the little children, you know, and people might experience, and ayahuasca, people talk about the serpent spirit, and then sometimes they talk about dancing spirits. So sometimes traditionally people see ayahuasca, two dancing male and female kind of couples, often associated with the music, you know, like that. But yes, the traditional people, they emphasize very strongly that what you're doing is you're not taking not so much the plant, but it's the spirit, you see. And that's why traditional healers, like it's traditional ayahuasca healers, they spend the entire time singing the spirit songs as icaros. They call the spirits. It's not the plant. They think it's not actually the plant that does the healing. The plant opens the connection to the spirits, and the spirits do the healing. And the ayahuasca people will often say that they do an apprenticeship in the jungle where they, you know, under an experienced shaman who introduces them to the thing. And then I remember just seeing one of the films recently, and the thing, well, he spent 2 years, you know, in apprentices, and I got to connect with 5 different spirits, or, you know, 20 different spirits, and associated with 20 different plants. And then if you spend longer time, you might get to know, you know, hundreds of plants, and the spirit connecting to each plant. And that would then enable you to teach, to work with the illnesses that all these different plants, you know, represent, the healing. And ayahuasca is often then mixed with other plants, specifically to the plants connected to that illness. So the traditional cultures live in a worldview that recognizes the reality of spirits, spirits being equally real, all kinds of spirits. Human spirits, plant spirits, animal spirits, environmental spirits, human spirits, like us. We're spirits in human form. And there are spirits in animal form and plant form. There's spirits that inhabit the whole planet, like the Earth, or the whole star, like the sun.
What differences have you seen advantageous or disadvantageous in regards to set and setting when you compare traditional ceremonial use of these compounds and a trained psychotherapist in a laboratory setting?
The research setting is also a ritual setting. Science demands certain ritual actions in terms of measurement and controlled environment. That setting determines the experience. You know, I remember Albert Hoffman who discovered LSD and psilocybin, telling me that once he accidentally discovered LSD, then he was asked by the Sandoz Pharmaceutical Company, which is a drug testing company, which, you know, created where he was working, and they wanted to do a drug test, like they do all the kind of drug tests, and he went on and he had a horror trip with LSD, and he said, I'm never going to do that again, because the environmental setting of a drug test in a pharmaceutical company is where people are sitting there with clipboards and, you know, and injections and, you know, and observers in white coats and lab coats, and it's a pharmaceutical lab. And he said he knew intuitively right away this is not the appropriate setting for this kind of experience. And that's why, and people have begun to understand that. In the 60s, of course, we didn't know that at all. And so that's why you had people dropping acid and going down to Haight Street and wandering among the multitudes. You know, it's actually surprising that there weren't more bad trips, or taking it in a setting where they're dancing with lots of people. Nowadays, you know, MDMA is used in therapy, but then the same drug is used at rave dances where thousands of people may be dancing and taking MDMA, the same drug, but they're not having healing experiences, but that's not the intention. And so the set and setting is always important, and I would say for the psychoactive and psychedelic substances, especially important. You know, for stimulant drugs and depressant drugs, it's not that, they'll work the same way, basically, no matter what setting you're in. And that's why you can get an antidepressant prescription and you just take it twice a day. These drugs are not like that. That's why the medical system really can't accommodate them. There's no way to accommodate them. You see the kinds of settings that have to be used where the doctor actually has to sit with the patient for 6 to 8 hours. How many doctors can afford to do that? They can't even sit with you for half an hour. It's not pharmacological, it's all psychological, it's political.
Could you talk a little bit about how you transitioned from the early days of research where you didn't really know about set and setting and maybe did it inappropriately, but eventually got to where you are now? You've described a context that's antithetical to this beautiful work. So how do we transition from that?
Research with these drugs now, I mean, I can't, you know, it's because it's illegal to do so. So my research is in terms of collecting experiences. I collected experiences from, you know, I've written 5 different books on the phenomenology of experiences, one on ayahuasca and the mushroom. It's actually, both those books are combinations of scientific chapters describing from the outside what do we know about the chemistry, the pharmacology, the botany, the cultural context, and then a whole set of experiences. And that's, I think, what needs to happen in terms of communicating. It's not enough just to report the experiences, that's okay, but then you also want to know the science. But it's not enough just to give the external science, because that doesn't explain why these plants have become so meaningful to people, either in their traditional society or in modern possible applications. But I think in terms of the possible applications of these substances that interest me the most in current thing, and I think that definitely worth pursuing, is in the treatment of iboga, in the treatment of addictions, or iboga, other substances too. MDMA, which I didn't talk about, which doesn't really have a plant pedigree, ancestral pedigree in that sense, at least none that we've found so far, has its most profound and significant application, I think, in the treatment of PTSD. Psilocybin and LSD, I think, in the end of life. I think end-of-life studies, you know, terminal anxiety, I think this culture has an enormous block about dealing with the reality of dying. And as a society, we'd like to pretend that we're not going to die. We like not to think about it. It seems like morbid. We're not supposed to think about it. That's very new. In traditional societies, that's not at all so. And in ancient societies, you had these death, rebirth mysteries where people recognize death is a fact of life, and you might as well get used to it and start looking at it and the reality and accepting the reality. And when you do so, it makes a huge difference. And that's why you have this whole field of study of near-death experiences. Now, the psychedelic drugs don't produce near-death experiences, but they produce a sense of being prepared. And I think Aldous Huxley, as he pioneered so many things, he pioneered that thing. He actually took LSD on his deathbed. He had arranged it ahead of time. Now, we're a long way away from being able to do that, but the idea of having a setting, and I think it's very helpful that people have now, you know, you have hospice settings where people can get out of it. The process of dying does not require a hospital any more than the process of birthing. I think birthing and dying should both be out of the medical, they're not medical emergencies. I mean, they can be, of course. But they were not, and people were birthing and dying long before they had a system of medicine, ever, you know? And so birthing at home in a natural protected environment, of course medical backup there necessary if needed, and dying at home is the traditional way, the ancient way, the cross-cultural way. And with a spiritual context, not this physical, psychological, and spiritual support system, should be part of it, I think. And it could be, and I think the culture is moving that way. And I'm very encouraged by the fact that the researchers who are doing the end-of-life studies now have gotten official permission to give psilocybin to people who are actually in the last stage of dying, which is quite a breakthrough from a bureaucratic point of view, you could say, because everybody knows it's not going to cure them, right? There is no cure. They're going to die. It's just going to alleviate the... so that I think this is a very significant breakthrough, and that application, I think, will prove to be more beneficial in the long run than many others, and very important. So,
Ralph, thank you. Thank you so much.
okay.
Thank you so much.